This is part two of our April 16th lecture. In part one, we dealt with certain issues regarding eugenics as they were related to evolution. But I want to start in a different way in part two. The factory worker got a letter from his daughter who was at college, and he was pretty much illiterate. So he asked his friend, his fellow factory worker, to read the letter. And the fellow factory friend read the letter. Dear Dad, college is rough. I have great needs. Send money now, please. And when the letter was read, um, the father was upset. He said, how could she so talk to me like that? I can't believe it. You just be so rough, and I thought she loved me, and so he said, I'm not going to give her a dime. And so he took the letter, stuffed it in his pocket, and went home. And then a day or two went by, and he started thinking about his daughter and missing her. And so he had his wife read the letter, and she said, uh, "Dear Dad," oh, excuse me, she didn't say that. She said, "Dear Dad, uh, college is rough, and I need some money. Please send some money." Same words, different tone. And tears rolled down his cheek. He sent a check, and she was able to get the things that she desired to get. Uh, so the question isn't always the facts. The question is, how do you tell the story? Now, this class lately has been dealing with how the Enlightenment tells the story of the world and of civilization, of what we should believe, of what we should not believe, and we've dealt with it on a number of different levels. Now, when we're talking concerning this subject, the subject of evolution, it's part of a broader strategy of Enlightenment um, telling the mythos, the myth of why their perspective is correct. But the same Enlightenment teller of stories also tell other stories about the badness of the church and the historic Catholic Church and of all of the things, all of the reasons why we should reject it as moral or true. Now, we're a little conflicted about this because we've studied the historic Christian church. We know there are things that happened in the Middle Ages that weren't right and that we wouldn't support. But you got to remember that this isn't a independent critique. This is not somebody who wants to get to the truth of the matter. Rather, this is somebody who's telling a story with a certain agenda. I'm talking about Enlightenment storyteller. So, for example, an Enlightenment storyteller would say, Christians are bad. The Pope ordered them to go on a crusade and capture Jerusalem and kill innocent Muslims and destroy wantonly women and children, and it was just a terrible thing. So, what would we say to that? Well, not everything that the Crusaders did was right. We're not suggesting that they were all on all the high moral high ground at all points. But you got to remember another thing. All of the areas that they were reconquering used to be Christian. And how did they turn Muslim? Was there some street meeting where people went to the altar and converted to Islam? No, 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 no. Islam conquered by the sword. They conquered all of North Africa and parts of Spain and all of the whole area where they were through. So to suggest that like Muslims good, Christians bad is a bit based on warfare is a bit disingenuous. Oh, okay. So you follow the train. Anything then for an Enlightenment thinker that can make Christianity bad, historic Christianity makes Christianity bad, makes any belief in religion bad, and so the agenda is there, and you can't miss the agenda. You'll read, oh, there were a couple million people destroyed by the church, claiming to be witches, or in the Middle Ages. Now, there was some of that that did occur, but always the numbers are overblown. And we would suggest it wasn't the Bible, and certainly not the New Testament that caused this, but that it was syncretism with some of the various superstitions of the land brought into what was the Christian church. So again, find any Christianity wart and all and demonstrate that it's bad, Christians bad, we good. Even the Reformation gets that sort of critique. So, for example, people will say religions always cause war. And if we got rid of religions, then we wouldn't have war. So, the Reformation, who claimed to be restoring the Catholic Church, the Reformation was actually a cause of great bloodshed. As a matter of fact, from the Reformation onward, for 130 years, there was religious wars. You see, religion is bad. Well, again, I'm not going to defend everything that was done in the Reformation. Sometimes we say because we believe that what Martin Luther said and did was good, we think that there was a great revival, and in part there was, but that was the smallest slice of the Reformation. The Reformation and all of the wars that followed were a part of the reconfiguring of Europe, where the feudal state was being supplanted by regional and then what would become nation states. And so part of what was going on was not at all religious wars, but it was political wars. You say, well, wasn't religion always involved? Well, here's the interesting thing. Sometimes the same religious group would ally with this one, and then they would come back and ally with this one against this one. So there was no pure, boy, we're going to make you religious, we're going to convert you by the sword, pristine sort of thing going on. It was always tied with something else. Again, Enlightenment storytellers are reading that letter from the daughter, and they're reading it in a certain way. Now, the main attack of Enlightenment thinking on the Christian religion comes through what we've already talked about at length in some classes, the supposed conflict between religion and science. And so the idea is whether it's Galileo or whether it's Darwin or whether it's some other thing, religion equals superstitious people who believe the stupidity things from the Bible. And scientists equal righteous people who have a great cause and they believe in the furtherance of civilization and progress and so on. And so, what we need to know is that you cannot trust religious kind of people, but you can only trust people who have true science in their heart of hearts. Now, was there some religious resistance to anything new in the medieval times? So, yeah, of course there was. But there was also, and it was a religious impulse, It wasn't scientists who started the universities. It was religious people who started the universities. And it wasn't scientists who said we should search for knowledge. It was religious people who said we should search for knowledge. What changed that? It wasn't a difference though between, well, hey, we got a new Bible, or now, boy, the blinders are off, now we see, and all that sort of thing. No, it was, as we have begun to discuss over and over again, a difference between which philosophical uh, uh, influence was going to be the strongest. And so we have suggested that in the medieval times, the strongest influence was Platonic philosophy woven into the theology of the church. Again, was that right? No, it wasn't right, but I'm just telling you why it happened. It has nothing to do with the Bible, it has nothing to do with God, it has nothing to do with um, superstition versus lack of superstition. It had to do with which philosophical underpinning was driving the either the thirst for knowledge or saying no, we don't have to do that. We can know everything in our head. Platonic thought was the prevailing influence until seeds of Aristotelian philosophy found their way in the scholastics. Remember the dates of the scholastics, 11 to 1700, circa. So when we say it was um, that it was the Bible, and they believed the Earth was the center of the solar system, and that's why the religious people were against Galileo. Again, that's the wrong story, but Galileo is the one who gets mentioned. It was actually, we'll go back to Copernicus. But here's the truth of the matter. The truth of the matter, yes, there were religious people who thought that the Earth was the center of the solar system, but you know why? It's because they read Aristotle. And Aristotle thought that the Earth was the center of the solar system. So the problem was not the Bible strictly or the church, say. The problem was inherently a philosophical one, and it gets laid over on the blame of the church. Now, that's a very important thing to understand. Plato and Aristotle believed in a certain kind of way of knowing. Well, they varied a little bit. Plato said it's in your head, it's all in this ideal realm. And Aristotle said, well, you have to do experiments, you have to create taxonomies, you have to do this kind of observation, empiricism. Even though they varied in that way, they didn't vary in this. They thought that you could find a place to stand for human reasoning in your own thinking. Now, think about this for a minute. The difference between that and Christianity is marked, is marked. And that is, Christianity says you have to start in relationship with God. You have to start with faith. You can't start with your own head. You have to start in relationship. Shema, Yisrael, Yahweh, Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. So it was Yahweh's our God. We're not going to try to formulate theories of why God must exist. We are starting in terms of relationship. And there's another thing that postmoderns have told us with regard to foundationalism, whether that's Aristotle or Plato or whatever. And this is what they said. They said, you said you had a place to stand, but what you covered over were your presuppositions that, in fact, every philosophical system requires faith. You have to sort of define things into existence. You have to state, well, here's a fact that is known, thus and so. And so the so called conflict between science and religion is one that is largely constructed for the benefit of telling the story in a certain way. All right, now let's finally get to Darwin here. Uh, Darwin was known for his 1859 work. Um, and we call it The Origin of the Species, but the actual name is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or, this is the title, big long title, The Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. All right, so here's the problem with Darwin as the hero for evolution. Hear the racist title? Basically, he says, all right, so there's natural selection, and so we got to figure out how the best people can be the ones who are in the gene pool for the coming generations, and that's how this thing's got to work, which is so interesting because that's a story that, of course, never gets told, and that we spoke about briefly. Leads to what's called in the textbook social Darwinism. So Darwinism was then used to support ruthless capitalism. So survival of the fittest. We'll eat up all those little companies, and We're not gonna. We're gonna be tough, and so on and so forth. And um, the classic example of this is a guy by the name of Andrew Carnegie, who um, basically was as ruthless a guy as you could get. And he loved Darwin, read Darwin. Military dictators loved Darwin. We're going to prove we're the we're the survival of the fittest. We are the ones who should be in charge. And people who wanted to do all kinds of things used Darwin as a kind of a means to get to their ends. So there were some pretty negative things that happened as a result of Darwinism. But the reason that modernism, uh, and I'm going beyond Enlightenment thinking now, I'm going to the kind of full flowered modernism of the late 19th century and of the first half of the 20th century. The reason that modernism loved Darwinism is because Darwinism propels the idea of progress. Because when you think about it, the Enlightenment, if it's all naturalism, if we're in a closed universe, if there is no God, if we're so much dirt that somehow accidentally through mutations and natural selection evolved out of the slime and eventually came to be who we are, like, what does that say about you? I mean, how can you say that you're good or better? Or what is the value? I mean, why is it right to do this and wrong to do that? What makes moral values moral? What by what template can you measure any of that? It's all just so much dirt. But Darwin promised the idea, and this is capital P, progress, that we are getting better and we will succeed. And that is the mantra of modernism. Enlightenment thinking proposed it, but nature proved it. Nature proves you can go from being a slime ball with a spark of life to being this incredible creature, and you can do all these things, and so on and so forth. We've already talked about how our whole school system is based on this notion. It came about, I don't want to, yeah, this will be, okay, so it came about, we talked about the advent of the social sciences, like psychology and sociology. One of the great sociologists was Emile Durkheim, and he was a great believer in Darwinian thought as applied to societies. Societies are getting better and better and better, more and more and more ethical. And he influenced a guy by the name of John Dewey. And John Dewey is the founder of the American education system, Western education in general. So we find a linkage there to every classroom you ever sat in public school. Now, here's the problem. We got to the 1980s and 90s and we turned the millennium, and by that time, postmodernism had come to the fore. Postmodernism was not buying the idea of progress anymore. They say, "Are you kidding me? You call that progress, blah, blah, blah." And in fact, they said anybody who's telling us a story is probably selling us a bill of goods. So there is no such thing as progress. We just are what we are. We can just know what we know. And so if somebody's telling you a story, there's some trick behind it, and we got to figure out how they're trying to maneuver, and it all becomes about power and the oppressed. And all of a sudden, you've got a system that collapses. Postmodernity is not the answer. Postmodernity is a protest. Postmodernity says it didn't work. What's going to happen? Are we going to continue to live like this? No, 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 no. Postmodernity can't survive. You can't give it to the next generation. You can't have a deconstructionist philosophy that says that I am positively living in a deconstructed world and I will prove that nothing is thus and so and that will give my life meaning. Yeah, that you can't pass that on to the next generation. So what's coming next, we don't know. But it'll probably be some kind of spiritualism, perhaps, some kind of authoritarianism, perhaps, but the culture's changing, and you're living in that time period. The good news, of course, about God is that the gospel transcends any culture. So, whatever way the culture goes, we don't have to fear that. In fact, what we can probably discern is that because we're living in such a becoming a more and more post-Christian culture in the West, um, the darker the night, the brighter the light shines. Now, cultural Christianity is dying. Just to say I'm a Christian doesn't get you anything. In fact, it gets you attacked. But to be a Christian and have power and have purpose, you will impact the world in which you live. Now, let's talk about a few things with regard to Darwinian thought, because I thought the chapter was excellent. It's one of the best pieces that I've seen on Darwinian thought. The church and science were the same. The people that were in the church and the people that were in science were the same. So there was some quote unquote science versus church things with regard to Darwinian movement, but as you read in the chapter, the story is told totally wrong. Most people that rejected Darwin, they had nothing to do with church. It had to do with the weakness of his argument. The church did read the book of Genesis, and so they read the book of Genesis, and it said everything in chapter 1 brings forth after its kind. Now, roughly speaking, a kind is a species. And so you should, a species remains a species. And so one species does not become another species. It's after its kind. That kind of, that's a clear statement. If taken at face value and authoritative, dispels any notion of a Darwinian evolutionary model. And then there's another scripture that's pretty clear, and you've memorized it in IPT, and that is, um, and the Lord God made man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils a breath of life, and man became a living being, Genesis 2:7. I remember we had a symposium, UGST symposium, where we had someone who was arguing for a 7-day creation on the one side, and on the other side, we had someone who was arguing for what's sometimes called the day age theory, that each day was like a creative age and so on, that things happen over time. But in the audience were some apostolics who were evolutionists. And they said, no, this we could actually read the biblical text and find evolution there. So the question was, well, how do you do that? And so they guess what they read? They read Genesis 2:7, and the Lord God made man. Of the dust of the ground, breathed his nostrils breath, and man became a living being. Well, how does that say that? Well, he just did it very slowly. He did it over the eons, and we were slime balls, but then we came to be a living soul. Well, there's one word for that, and we've studied it in this class, and the word is allegorical. That would be an allegorical interpretation of Genesis 2:7. Now, Genesis 1 is a song. It's a hymn. It is not a scientific textbook. But neither can you just take it as like fanciful or that it means nothing. It means something, and it has a context and it has a meaning, so you have to take it seriously. So you can't simply go back to Genesis 1 and Genesis or Genesis 2 and say, well, I think I'm imposing this upon the text. Can't do it. It's just not possible to do that. I want to close this lecture with um, Darwin's own weaknesses. No, the reason that Darwin didn't publish was not because he was afraid of churchmen, but the reason, he has his voyage on the Beagle, and it's not for another 30 years that we have this publishing that takes place. So why didn't he publish? Well, here's a simple reason. He didn't publish because he didn't have the evidence. Da, 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 da. Okay, now we've talked about this before. Just you don't go to a university which is based on naturalism and try to disprove evolution. They're not even going to talk about evolution because evolution is the operating system. It's like you don't go to church and say, "Oh, I wonder if there's a God. Let's debate whether there's a God." No, that's the operating system. So, in my entire graduate program and doctorate of religion, I was there 9 years. We never debated that. We debated the results of that, of Darwinian evolution and so on and so forth. And there were even people who critiqued it, but they say, well, what are you going to do? What else you got? Again, it's the system that drives naturalism. And even though there are varying ways of seeing evolution, and there is no true quote unquote Darwinist without remainder left, still it is some sort of modified form of Darwinian evolution that is the railroad tracks on which naturalism runs. So here's my question, and it's not original with me, but I'm just passing it on. Um, it winds up being a matter of faith, uh, and the reason why you know that, uh, I read this recently. I really liked it. One scholar said, "How would you falsify? Uh, in other words, how could you prove Darwinian evolution false? What would make you stop believing Darwinian evolution?" Well, some would say perhaps if the geological record didn't bear that out. Ding, 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 ding. Guess what? The geological record doesn't bear it out. When you look at the so-called layers that should progress on the geological column, they're all they're not ordered in the same way that you would suppose them to be ordered, and you don't find this sort of gradual. Uh, there's like this to that to this to that and so on and so forth, and the geological layers are not the same in different parts of the world. And when life does appear, it appears suddenly in a burst of life. So that doesn't help Darwinian evolution. Well, say, well, we know what that is. That's punctiliar equilibrium. In other words, there was a sudden rush of life. Well, wait a minute. First of all, it's not Darwinism, and secondly, you didn't explain how that happened. You just said that it was. how would you falsify Darwinism? Well, if you couldn't find the missing link, stop, 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 stop. There is not a missing link. There's missing links between everything, all over the place. And this lack of fossilized record led Darwin to not even present his theory at first. He said, but he finally presented and said, well, we'll find it after a while. So that apparently didn't slow anyone down in believing in Darwinism. They said, if scientifically we could prove that the idea of progress couldn't take place, then I suppose that would falsify Darwinism. Stop, 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 stop. Ever heard of the second law of thermodynamics that says everything in nature tends towards decay and chaos and not towards building up? You don't have a oh, you don't have a factory blowing up and creating a watch. A watch is an intelligent design that created that, so on. Well, I am out of time here, so I could say more, but I know you're wanting to go. I don't know where you wanted to go, but you're needing to go do something, I'm quite sure. And so I just want to end by saying this. Um, you don't have to apologize to anybody about anything. Do you believe in faith? Yes. Do evolutionary Darwinian evolutionists believe in faith? Yes. But their faith leads to nothing. It leads to mud and dirt, and it can't be sustained, and it's like the king who has no clothes, the emperor has no clothes. It's a barren system, and it's only held together because it's needed to preserve the myth of the Enlightenment um, kind of faith. Now, postmodernity, while attacking Enlightenment, has not attacked evolution. They're open to other things, maybe aliens, planet life, or any number of theories. So long as you don't make God the authority, because that's their meta narrative. They don't want a meta narrative. But we can believe what we believe, and we can believe in science, and we can believe in progress, but the progress that we believe in is not based on human ability, but at its source is based on relationship with God. Now, couple of housekeeping things. You'll find the reading for Darwinism, which has the response questions, in the God's Infallible Word folder. So if you haven't read it, you need to read it because you need that for that. There's also the next lecture um, on environmentalism, and that's on Tuesday, and then on next Thursday we're going to be going over the review for the final exam. There is no required reading, but there will be a reading that you can do response paper on for extra credit. Thank you so much. God bless, and you have a great day.